and it is animal digestion. Whose scat is that? So Olivia's grossed out. Do you guys know what scat is?
Poop.
Poop. Scat is poop. So I thought you guys would be interested in this topic today. It's a little bit silly, but we're going to have our usual introduction. We're going to talk about digestion in animals, and we'll do identification of different kinds of scat. We'll do some homework, and then we'll go through our resources. So as an introduction, I have something new to tell you guys about me today. So I bet you didn't know this, but one of my things that I do to volunteer is I am a volunteer in park, or a VIP, at a national park here in California called Pinnacles National Park. And Pinnacles is a super cool national park. It has condors that breed there, and it's got a bunch of talus cave formations, which are like caves that form because rocks fall over. So they're like kind of above ground caves almost. And I volunteer there, and one of the things that I do is teach the kids that come into the nature center about the different kinds of scat from the animals that we have in the park. And we actually have little silicone molds of different kinds of scat so the kids can guess what they are. And I also, part of my background in science is with poop, of all things. So when I used to do research in metabolism, I collected a lot of dog and monkey and other kinds of poop to see what they were excreting and what they were digesting, metabolizing. So because of that, I thought you guys might be interested in hearing some of these facts, even though they're a little bit gross. So you guys know why we're chatting today. Yay, it's summer, but your moms and dads are still working, and you guys should still be able to have some fun and learn some new things. And maybe you can learn some silly facts that you can tell your moms and dads or your friends later. Sorry, the cat is playing behind me. She's making noise. So first of all, before we talk about scat, we're going to talk about digestion, because that's where it comes from, right? So what is digestion? Digestion is kind of a process in our bodies where we're breaking down food into usable parts. So the reason we eat is to provide our bodies with fuel and also with building blocks to build things that we need in our bodies and grow. And so you guys know the kind of the process. First, you do what Ray is doing, right? You chomp, chomp, chomp. You got to put that food in your mouth and eat. And it looks like Ava's having a snack too. So that part is called ingestion, which is when you put food in your mouth. And that's kind of the start of the digestive system. And then it goes into mechanical and chemical breakdown before it releases energy, so you guys can do things like dance. So the first part of that is mechanical digestion. And mechanical digestion is kind of like smashing a biscuit with a hammer in this picture. So what you're doing is breaking the food down into smaller pieces. And that is what helps the chemical part later on have more parts to work on. So this relates to a concept called surface area. And this is kind of an interesting concept, but I think the easiest way to explain it is if you have, let's say, some sugar. Let's say you have a handful of sugar and you have that same amount of sugar in a lollipop. Which one is going to dissolve faster?
The one in your hand.
Yeah, the loose sugar. And that's because it has more surface area for the chemicals to work on. So there's more touchable space. Even though it's the same stuff, because there's more touchable space, the chemicals can work on it more and get to it faster. Kind of like the difference between like a big rock and a sand is similar. So when we're chewing, we're breaking down food so that the chemicals that digest it later have more surface area to work on and can work on it quicker. So there's lots of different things that we use for mechanical digestion, and animals use some of these same things. So the first one here is a beak. So birds use beaks, and so do squid. Squid have beaks, and they use those to chomp on their food and break it into some smaller pieces. So toucans obviously aren't eating the same thing as squid. Toucans mostly eat fruit, but squid are using it to break down pieces of fish and jellyfish and things like that. We also use our tongues for mechanical digestion, and so do animals. So here you can see this giraffe is pulling food into its mouth and can also break food apart a little bit with its tongue. So the tongue obviously isn't as strong as a beak or as teeth, like you see on this, I think it's a sheep's head fish. And I picked this one because it looks weird, like it has human teeth. Most fish don't have human looking teeth, but teeth in general help us break down that food. And another,
I'm eating and using my teeth right now.
exactly. And so is Rhea, and it looks like Ava might be using her teeth too. So as we're doing that, we're breaking those food pieces down so that we can more easily use them as fuel. But there's more to my mechanical digestion than just what we have in our mouths, right? Actually, in your stomach, there are muscles and things that continue to churn and move that food and break it apart. And this is a human stomach on the right. And you can see that there is muscle in there that's moving the food around, which is part of the reason you can sometimes feel your tummy rumbling and moving about, is because it's kind of sloshing that food around in there. And this, even though it looks kind of gross, is a chicken's gizzard. So this is an organ that chickens have inside them. And you can see it's got a really tough lining to it, but then the outside is really thick muscle. And chickens and other birds ingest rocks. And the rocks hang out in their gizzard, and then the muscles in the gizzard, because it has that tough lining, it mixes up the rocks in the food, because chickens don't have teeth, right, to break up their food. So the rocks and the gizzard help to mechanically break down the food that the chickens are eating. So they kind of use that in place of teeth.
Dodo birds also had them.
Oh,
and people think that is one of the reasons that they couldn't fly, because they were being weighed down from eating big rocks.
Oh, yeah, that could be. Birds also have something called a crop, which, so their esophagus is the tube that travels from our mouth down to our stomachs, right? And birds have kind of a weigh station there called a crop, where it's like a kind of a pouch that hangs out there, and food can mix up in there too before it goes to the gizzard. So sometimes if you see like chickens and things like that, their necks kind of look like they're hanging out funny. Not the red waddly flaps, but they'll kind of look like they have a fat bulge there, and that's actually their food filling up their crop. So dodos might have been weighed down by all the food they were eating that was hanging out in their crop as well. And if you remember from the flamingo lesson last week, pigeons and flamingos can also produce a kind of milky fluid from the crop. So the crop and the gizzard both help with mechanical digestion, but a lot of what goes on in the actual stomach is chemical digestion. So as the muscles are mixing things around, what they're mixing the food with is acids and enzymes and things in the stomach that help to break down that food. And the reason that we're, those gastric juices, we call them, in our stomachs and in animal stomachs, what those are doing with the food is breaking them into usable parts and nutrients. So as we're eating and things are going through our stomach and then into the intestines where this chemical digestion is taking place, then we can move on to a really important step called absorption. And when you absorb something, you're kind of taking it in. So this is where our bodies bring in the nutrients and also the water that's in the foods and things that we eat and the liquids that we drink, and they're pulling them into the bloodstream. So those go into blood vessels and things that are around our intestines, and then those can be used as fuel and as building blocks. Sorry, the kitty cat is, can you guys see the kitty cat? She's playing with a mouse back here, so she's making much noise. She's very silly. Sorry about that. So we're absorbing all the nutrients and the building blocks and things so that we can continue to power our bodies and so that animals can power their bodies. And then after all that, there's still some stuff left over, right? So we're absorbing nutrients, and then the stuff that's left over is kind of like garbage, right? And so that garbage has to go somewhere. And that's when we, or animals, evacuate or go poop. So while those kind of boluses or balls or bits of stuff are being pushed through our digestive system, they go through something called segmentation. And segments means like bits or pieces. So worms are segmented, and you could think of different like Lego blocks as being segments. So they're being broken into different pieces. And what segmentation does in our bowels or in the organs that are processing these foods is they separate the food and then they push it back together. So it mixes it with the digestive juices that it came into contact with before, and then it pushes it against the side walls of the intestines and things so that that absorption can happen and we can get those nutrients. So as you can see here, if you have two different things traveling through and one is yellow and one is blue, then it's going to push each of those in half and then push them back together. So now they're mixing and there's a little bit of blue and yellow. And then it'll do that again and again until it's all kind of the same throughout. And when most of the food and the nutrients have been absorbed by our bodies, another type of muscular movement starts to happen in our intestines, and that just pushes the leftovers basically further along the small intestines and into the large intestines so that we can evacuate them. So this segmentation has a lot to do with how scat or poop ends up looking outside the body because of this mixing. And it's basically putting it into kind of bits. And so you can imagine if if an animal's body is doing a lot of this segmentation, they're probably going to have smaller little bits of poo. And if they're not doing a lot of segmentation, then it might be kind of like a big blob, right? So it does depend on like the strength of these contractions of the muscle. And another thing that impacts the way that scat looks in animals is the sphincter at the end of the line. So the anal sphincter is like a muscle. It's like a ring of muscle that hangs out there and does its job of hopefully keeping all the waste inside until it's time to let it out. So if animals didn't have a muscle there, they would kind of just be going poo wherever and whenever all the time. So the sphincter is kind of holding things in until the end. And then when it's time, that muscle can loosen or contract. And because of that, it also can kind of squeeze the remainders, the leftovers, the scat, into different sizes and shapes, depending on how it opens and closes. So why is the poop shaped like that? Two main reasons that we just went through. The first one is the different digestive systems. So I talked a little bit about how segmentation works. So as it's segmenting and then going through the intestines and then actually exiting through the anal sphincter, that impacts the shape. But also diet impacts it a lot. So you can see here, these animals have very, very different diets. And so you can imagine the diet of a panda that's only eating bamboo is going to look really different or the scat of a panda only eating bamboo is going to look really different from the scat of something like a lion that's eating meat all the time. So you guys have probably noticed, out in your neighborhood, bird poop looks different than dog poop, looks different than I guess cow poop, things like that. So depending on the diet and also how their digestive systems work, they can look really different. Okay, so now we're going to get to the next part, which is figuring out whose scat that is. And this seems really like a silly thing, but remember when I told you before that I volunteer at the national park and I help people identify scat? There's a reason for that. You can tell a lot about the animals in your community or in certain habitats by what scat you see. You can tell how a lot about animals' health and their diets from looking at that scat. And very importantly, for those of us who live in areas with large predators, you can tell if predators are nearby. So if you're doing something like camping and you see a mountain lion poop next to a place where you thought you were going to put up your tent, it's probably not the best place to put a tent up, right? So we need to be aware of these things in our surroundings so that especially when we're camping and we're hiking, we can make sure that we're staying safe, but also it's interesting to see what kind of animals are hanging around, right? Because a lot of times we might not see the animals because they're secretive or they're moving at night, but we do see their leftovers. So we're gonna start off with a silly one. Does anybody know whose poop this is? What does it look like? It's kind of a cube shape, right?
Boxes.
Yeah, it looks like little boxes, which seems weird, right? Who could possibly make poop that is cube shaped? Well, the answer is really silly. It's a wombat. So wombats actually poop cubes, and they do that so that they can mark their territory. So wombats leave little piles of poops on top of like rocks and things around their territory to mark the outsides of the edges. And what would happen if their poo was round and they tried to put it on top of a rock? Or tried to
fall off?
It would fall off. So the cube shape means that the poop can hang out wherever they decide to deposit it. and continue to mark their territory without rolling away. And scientists for a long time have been really unsure about how poo could even be cube-shaped. And what they've determined recently is that the muscles, the way the muscles work in the wombat's intestines, they're really strong in some places and kind of weaker in others. And so those working together tend to make the cube shape. And then they've also discovered that wombats are extracting almost all of the water out from their feces because they live in Australia, right? So it's kind of like a hot, dry place in a lot of areas. So they need to conserve that water. So as they're pulling the water out, it's compacting the poo into these shapes. And the other interesting thing about that is wombats in zoos, if you think about it, they probably have free access to water. They can drink a lot more. And so their poo isn't as cube-shaped, it's more round. So it has both to do with their diet and water intake, as well as with their intestinal muscles. So this next one, I put in here mostly for Carmen and Inez, but this I'm gonna tell you is actually hedgehog poop. So hedgehog poo is kind of weird because we would think of hedgehogs as, you know, plant eaters, but hedgehogs are actually carnivores. So they like to eat insects and things, and people that own hedgehogs usually actually feed them cat food because they need a lot of protein. So hedgehogs live in the wild in Europe in a lot of places, and so people might see this kind of poo in their garden, and it's kind of tapered at one end. Tapered means it gets skinnier. So you can see down here, and it's got lots of bits of it, like berry parts and stuff, and pips from berries. And there can also be insect body parts in there because hedgehogs like to eat insects. So a lot of times in Europe, you can find this in garden lawns and school fields and things like that. So this next one, you can actually see in America, and I have seen this in Wisconsin. Does anybody know what the state animal and what the universities in Wisconsin have on their crest?
No.
Badgers. So I went to school at University of Wisconsin, so we're the Wisconsin Badgers. And there actually are wild badgers in Wisconsin, and I've seen them. It's very cool. But badger poo is kind of a weird thing. A lot of the texture and things depend on the diet, but badgers eat worms and berries and sometimes meat they find from dead animals on the side of the road and things. And badgers do something interesting, which is where they usually have a kind of a latrine or a special potty area where they go that are at the edge of their territories. So kind of like the wombat, they're marking their territory by leaving these piles of poo. And so this is a picture of the badger poo and their kind of badger potty that they have. So you might see this in some areas of the United States. This next one is really common. This guy, you might be able to see in your backyard or in some open fields. And what do you see kind of hanging out in here? Does anyone know what that is?
Fur.
Fur. And you can also see here there's some berry bits. So what does that tell you about this animal's diet?
It's omnivorous.
Yeah, very good. So this is actually fox poo. So fox poo is usually kind of long and twisted around, and if you look in it, you might be able to see some berries, bits of berries. You might be able to see bits of bone or fur and grass and things like that. And fox also leave their poo to mark their territory, and so sometimes they'll leave it on dead animals, they'll leave it on shoes, they'll leave it on garden toys. It can be on just about anything, so that's why somebody pictured it on a shoe.
Yeah, is that why they put it on a shoe?
Yeah. So if you're out in your yard and you find something kind of odd like that, it might be a fox actually marking its territory. And so around our houses, so in urban areas, foxes tend to eat a lot of like meat and bread and bird seed and things, and so their poo might look a little bit more like small dog droppings. But in rural areas where they're eating more of their natural diet, it's usually kind of twisted at one end like you see here. So this is something that you might actually see in your neighborhood, and we don't a lot of times see foxes with our eyes, but we might find this poo later. And I know at Aiden and Lizzie's house in Wisconsin, in our backyard is a train station or a train depot, and there's foxes that live back there that we've seen in the family every year, and so sometimes we find this fox poo outside.
Once when I was taking Frodo for a walk, we saw it was in the morning, and we saw this bright red fox.
Cool. Yeah, so you do have them in your neighborhood, so you'll have to keep an eye out for fox scat.
There's one that used to live under our porch.
Oh, wow. I bet he doesn't anymore now that Frodo's there.
Nope.
Yeah. So this one is a little bit silly. This one's, you can see in northern Wisconsin and around some lakes and things, and also in Europe. This is otter poo. So otter droppings are actually called something silly called spraint, which I had never heard that word before. So this is otter spraint, and they're usually kind of coarse and black. And you can see here that there's a lot of fish scales and shell fragments in there. So this is how diet impacts scat. This is a really good example of it. So you can see, because otters are eating fish and shellfish and things, their poo is full of the leftovers because they can't digest fish scales, obviously. So sometimes you'll also see crayfish parts, or sometimes feathers from birds they've eaten, or fur. And because of all the like weird undigestible stuff that comes out in otter poo, once it dries, it gets kind of pale and crumbly. So as it when it's fresh, it'll look like this, and then when it dries out, it'll look like that. So this one would be a really, really uncommon one, probably for most of us to see. I don't know if I've ever seen an otter in the wild, but you can take a look for this around streams and lakes and rivers. And they'll often kind of leave this around on grass mounds or rocks nearby the river where they live. So the next one is actually pretty unfortunately common. Does anybody recognize this one?
Deer? No, that's not.
These are actually, yeah, these are rat droppings. So you can tell because they're kind of oval shaped and they're tapered or pinched at the ends. And they look kind of like almost like little olive pits. And when they're fresh, when like just when the rat leaves them, they're kind of darker colored, and then they dry out like this, and they can look kind of tan-ish as well. I used to work with rats a lot, and rats just kind of like poop wherever they're going. They don't seem to really go in one spot. So a lot of times when we were holding rats, or like if they were sitting on my shoulder, they'd go poop or pee and leave these little gross rat nuggets. And so they're kind of scattered in a group usually. So if you see these around outside, it's probably not a big deal. If you see these in your house, you should definitely tell an adult, because that's not good. But these are pretty small as well. Mouse droppings are sort of similar, but a lot smaller than this. This one you guys probably know.
Bunny.
Yeah, so these are bunny droppings. So
my cousin has 2 bunnies, so you can see them in their cage.
Yeah. So rabbits actually have 2 different kinds of droppings that they leave. One is kind of like these little brown ones that are waste, and then these bigger ones, they actually re-eat because they have like more fiber and chemicals and enzymes and things in them. So you might see 2 different kinds of rabbit droppings out and about in your yard. And this is a really common one to see everywhere, because rabbits also like to go in kind of one place that we call a latrine. And so if you see a bunch of rabbit droppings in one place, it's probably right by their burrow. So you can kind of investigate and see what's around. Here's another one. This answers kind of a question that Rhea had. Does anybody know what kind of animal this might be from? See how there's white stuff up here?
Bird?
Yeah, so birds excrete, they don't have urine or pee like humans or a lot of other animals or mammals. They excrete uric acid, and uric acid is whitish. So all of their waste comes from one hole called a cloaca. And so it's kind of like the poo and pee is mixed together almost. And
pigeons have that.
Yeah, exactly. So this kind of big round poo is from a Canada goose. So this one is also really common to see on like piers and things like that if you're at the lake or by the water. And Canada goose poo is kind of big and it's usually coiled up, and you'll see the outer layer of white uric acid on it. So you'll see this on grass and paths and things near rivers and ponds really frequently, or on docks or things if you're going to get on boats. Sometimes there's a big problem with Canada geese hanging out there, and then there's lots and lots of Canada goose poop. So the next one That's kind of important. Remember before I talked about knowing what predators are around if you're hunting or camping or hiking. This is a good one to know. These are bear scat. So these drawings of bear scat show you that there's kind of different types of bear poo. And so you need to be on the lookout for these, obviously. You know, if you're out somewhere like Yellowstone or Yosemite, or you're in a very, very, I guess you're up north somewhere, this is something you'd want to kind of keep an eye on. And so these two very common types are kind of the globular, meaning like it's kind of in like a big bundle and it's got berries and seeds and vegetation in it. Or if they've been eating other animals, it'll be kind of longer and tapered and have hair and bone and fiber in it. So these kinds of bear scat can look very, very different, but it's also good to keep in mind that these piles are going to be bigger than what you would see from most other animals. So if you're ever, you know, out and about camping or something, you could figure out what the bear's been eating. And based on that, there's these other cool pictures that I found. These are all kinds of bear poop, and you can see they look super, super different, right? So this one on the top left, they've been eating a lot of vegetation like grass and things, and so their poo is a little bit more segmented. And then when they're eating like lots of, let's see, this one is eating a lot of salmon, so it's more of kind of a loose pile, and you can see fish scales in it. So you can guess a lot about what the bears have been eating and like how their health is from their scat. And so there are researchers that will collect bits of this to analyze, and you can even sometimes get DNA and things from scat to identify individual animals. So let's see. Oh, and this is cool too, because there's someone's foot or rubber boot right next to it. So you can see how big this pile of bear poo is next to it. So here in California, where we have mountain lions, and at pinnacles, we also have bobcats. So we keep an eye out for that kind of scat at the park, but we don't have bears, so I don't have to worry about bears. That's good. Okay, so as I mentioned, the reason that we research scat is to learn more about specific animals and to learn about their habitats, the areas that they live in, and their diets. And so now I'm going to go into a little bit of homework with you guys where we're going to talk about those things. So for little kids, there's a couple pictures you can draw. You can draw a mechanical digestion tool, I call it, so like a beak or teeth or something like that. You can draw an animal in your area and the food that they eat, or you can draw an animal in your area and their scat. So like, you have foxes, raccoons, or hedgehogs, you can draw them. For big kids, you can draw a picture of, for big kids, you can draw a picture of a mechanical and chemical digestion working together. You can make a comic about scat identification and why you might do that, or you can write some sentences about why scat comes in different shapes and forms. You can, let's see, for middle schoolers, you can write a paragraph explaining how mechanical and chemical digestion work together. You can draw a local animal in their scat and label identifying features, or you can create a comic about animal scat and why people learn to identify it. And then of course you can email your homework to me and we'll put you in the drawing at the end. And then there's a lot more resources here. So you can even find quizzes and things online if you're interested in learning how to identify scat, because a lot of people do that as part of like animal tracking. If you remember, we talked about how we track tortoises and desert animals and things like that earlier, and scat tracking is an important part of that.